Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I wish I could remember who it was that said it, but the line was something like, "Only in America do we give thanks for all that we have by eating too much food and then running out the very next day to get even more." Of course, that isn't really what thanks looks like. Perhaps thanks looks more like a pastor who is waiting in 45-degree water, who has fallen down and his waders are now filled with water, but has managed to get back up and kept walking. That was fun. Not one of my better moments. My friend who was with me said, "Chris, you had this look on your face like you were going to die." And I was like, well, I had a brief moment there when I thought maybe I was going to die. But here I am. Now, when it comes to Thanksgiving, we've really turned this whole Thanksgiving idea into yet another consumer activity to further drive the American economic machine, and it's practically its own industry. Thanksgiving serves as yet another opportunity for us to buy stuff. So how do we, in the middle of this busyness of modern living, how do we practice real Thanksgiving? As usual, we have 3 readings for today. One is from the Hebrew Bible, what we often call the Old Testament. One is from the letters of the New Testament, which we fancifully call epistles because we have to have fancy names for everything. And the last reading is from the Gospels. As this is a special holiday, the readings are all chosen to align with each other, which as a preacher I can tell you usually is not the case. Now, Deuteronomy is not a book that most of us think too much about. It is written as if it is a final address given by Moses before he goes up onto the mountaintop and passes away. And then the people, led by Joshua, enter the promised land. In our reading for today, there are 2 major admonitions. Remember what God has done for you, and be thankful for the resources that you have been given. The need to count your blessings. At the same time, the text reminds us that there is a danger in affluence, a danger in being comfortable, because you can forget that God is the ultimate source of all that you have. Sometimes in your comfort you may think you earned it, that it's yours, you made it, and forget about God's actions in your life. In our reading from 2 Corinthians, you might recall that Paul had committed himself to raising money to support the poor Christians back in the Jerusalem church. Now, apparently at this point, the Corinthians have been reluctant to help him out. Hence, this invitation to be generous. Recognizes that what we have, again, is from God. But in response to God's gift, we are to be generous with others. And notice that the ministry to glorify God is tightly connected with generosity in giving. In Luke, we have this story that takes place on the way to Jerusalem. It occurs in this frontier region between Jews and Samaritans. It is a complex story that I must admit I've never been completely happy with most explanations, because the 9 who didn't give thanks were simply doing what they had been instructed to do, and that was required by Jewish law. So rather than see this as a criticism of the other 9, I think it's important to see how the faithfulness of this one Samaritan is being lifted up here by the author. Giving thanks for God's salvation, for that's the root of the word healed in this text, is the natural and appropriate and godly faithful response. And we, as people of God today, are called upon to imitate this foreigner, this Samaritan. Now I'm just realizing that with all these texts about giving and generosity, this would have been a great opportunity to preach a stewardship sermon. And with some members of the endowment committee present, they probably would say, well, Chris, why didn't you take that opportunity? I apologize to the endowment committee. I was thinking about something totally different when I put this sermon together. The church I grew up in always had a Thanksgiving service the night before Thanksgiving. And when I began serving my last church, I thought it would be so cool to have something similar. But I was told by most people that they wouldn't be able to attend because they'd be too busy getting ready for Thanksgiving. I suggested a morning service on Thanksgiving then, but they told me the same thing. They'd be too busy. Now, I haven't bothered to suggest either idea here at Bethany because I'm pretty sure I'd be told the same thing. We're too busy. Now, I don't mention this to criticize the folk at my former church or even any of the folk here. I understand why we're all busy. But the beautiful thing is we can celebrate the holiday on the Sunday before, like what we're doing today. But I hope that in some way we can move past this busyness of it all and practice some genuine thankfulness. There are a few points from the text that I want to point out. The first one is to remember. Remember what God has done. Memory here is so important. It pulls us out of the busyness of the present and allows us to see something of the big picture. Second of all, be grateful for all the resources that God has provided. Because it isn't all about us. In the grand scheme of things, even a dry turkey is not a big deal. Besides, that's what gravy is for anyway, right? Gratitude brings us peace and also connects us with God and each other. And lastly, follow in God's footsteps by being generous with others. Jesus calls us to follow his example. We advocate for the needy, we heal the sick, and we share our resources with others. It is a challenge to overcome the busyness of our modern world, and Thanksgiving isn't always an easy thing because it does take work. Especially since in our society we're all so busy. It even requires us being countercultural. Our society tells us that our value is dependent upon what we do. That deserving people are rewarded with possessions. And we can pat ourselves on the back for all of our hard work. Well, we Protestants have a name for that. We call it works righteousness. But our faith tells us that all that we have is from God. Life and all its treasures are a gift from God. And that we are to be thankful for all that we have. So during this time, I encourage you to set aside some time for yourself, to remember what God has done for you, and to be grateful for for the resources that God has provided you with. And don't let your busyness prevent you from being generous towards others. Normally you hear things like stop, look, and listen. I would suggest something a little bit different for the event of Thanksgiving. Stop. Step away from all the busyness for a moment. Look. See all the places where God has blessed you and continues to bless you. And lastly, give. Find ways to share what you have of your time, your talents, your treasures with others. To circle back to the beginning, obviously stuffing ourselves with more than we should eat is not really giving thanks. And filling our day with busyness isn't really either. So that's why we should stop, look,